Hey everybody, it's Alex from Engineering Applied. In this video, I'll be giving you an overview of the Extrude command in Fusion 360. Let's get started. Okay everybody, so here we are in our design space, and as you may have seen in the thumbnail, we're working with an enclosure cover. So inside of this enclosure, we'd have a printed circuit board that is kept safe from the elements, while also having access to the various USB ports that are found on the printed circuit board itself. So our objective in this video is to learn how to use the extrude command, but apply that to a realistic real world example. So first, what we want to do is we want to go to the top left-hand region here. So this is in the create section. So within the section, we can click on extrude, and it'll bring up this little window here, this little dialog box with several different options here. And so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to step through each one of these options, starting in the top left-hand corner and working our way down, with a exception here for the thin extrude, which I'll circle back to after we run through all of the regular extrude stuff. At the top, we have our type section. So within this section, we can designate whether we want to use a standard extrude or a thin extrude. We'll go ahead and start with the standard extrude, and we'll come back to this later. Next, we have our profile section. So this is where we can select either sketch profiles or faces within the model to use as an extrusion feature. Okay, so let's say, for example, we want to extend the height of all of these walls in one go without projecting any sketch geometry or anything like that. All we would have to do is select the surfaces that we want to extrude. Okay, and then we can go ahead and set a distance. So let's say I want to bring this up by 1/4 of an inch, for example. It'll go ahead and extend that for me. And as you may have noticed, we can go ahead and click and drag this arrow to quickly visualize or position something as required. And then we can also grab this little button here, and while holding left mouse, we can move it side to side to change that angle there. Okay, so this is a very useful tool for a quick workflow. Now, let's go ahead and go back to this profile section and go ahead and deselect all of our selections. We can do this a couple of ways. The first way is we can go ahead and hit this X button here to deselect everything, or we can use the Shift key to selectively remove various entries from our overall selections. Okay, so for example, let's say we're selecting all of this very quickly, but we accidentally click on this face here. All we have to do is hold the Shift key on the keyboard and then left click that face that you want to remove while holding Shift. And as you can see, that face is now deselected. So when I go ahead and raise or lower these faces, this face that I did not want to move is unaffected. Now let's go ahead and select some sketch profiles. So I went ahead and created a sketch on this face here. And all we have to do with the profile selector active is hover over our profile of interest and select that. So for example, if I hover over the very center of this, it will extrude this region. If I hover over this area, it will only extrude this ring, which is what I want to do in this case. You can also pick up other elements. So I can pick up an area around it. So this can be kind of used in the opposite of what you would expect. So I could say, well, I want to raise every other surface with the exception of this one space. You could do that and select this area. But again, I want to go ahead and extend this feature up. So all I'll do is left click in this area, and I can either use the arrow to extend it. I can push into the material to cut through that material. But let's go ahead and extend it up about, 0.25 inches is good. Moving down, we have the start area. This area allows us to designate how we want to start the extrude. So for example, by default, it's set to profile plane. What does that mean? Well, the profile plane is the plane in which your initially selected profile resides. Okay, so for example, this sketch resides on this face here. Okay, so it's going to start the extrude off of this face. Now, if I were to sketch some sort of profile up on this edge or just use the face itself, this would be the starting point for that extrude, as you've already seen earlier in the video. Now, our next option is the offset option. The offset option allows us to shift the start point of our extrusion. Let's say, for example, we have this raised feature on the underside of the cover, and we want to use this face here to continue that extrusion, but leave a gap between the old profile and the new one. So we'll go ahead and select this face here, go ahead and pull this out some arbitrary distance. It doesn't matter for this example. Now, we want to leave a gap between the end point of the previous feature and the start point of this new one. So what we'll go ahead and do is set an offset value, okay? So let's say we want to set a gap of 80 thousandths of an inch. We'll go ahead and type in 0.08. And as you can see, we have left a gap, or we have created an 80 thousandths of an inch offset between the plane that we initially referenced for the profile and where our actual extrusion starts. Our next start option is the object option. So how this works is we select a reference plane or face, and that will designate the start point for our extrusion. So in this example, we'll go ahead and select that same face that we did for the offset option by going up to Profiles, clicking on the Select button, and selecting our profile of interest. Now we want to go ahead and select our object of interest, okay? Which in this case will be this face here. So essentially what's happening is we're designating our reference face as our start point for this extrusion. So now all we have to do is set our distance for the extrusion. So we'll say 0.4 inches. And there we go. Now we've got our extrusion that starts at our reference face. Additionally, we can also specify an offset when using the object start option. Okay, so in this case, of course, we have it starting with this reference face, but let's say we want to offset it backwards from that reference face by 0.2 inches. Well, all we have to do is go into this offset field and type in our 0.2 inches. And as you can see, it offsets this feature backwards by 0.2. And of course, if I put a negative sign in front of that, it'll reverse the direction and it'll go in that opposite direction. On a side note, I'd like to point out that it's important when using options like the object option that you are specifically selecting the appropriate selection button as required. So when I'm selecting profiles, I want to make sure I have this button activated. Okay, so now I can select my profile. And when I select my object to reference the start point of this extrusion off of, I need to make sure that this is selected first. So if I wanted to use this face as my reference face, but I forget to select this button here, it'll pull that extrusion up to that face. That's not really what I want to do. What I want is I want to set a distance for this, and I want to select the start point, okay, which is this face. Now, this time around, when I made sure that I selected the correct button, I've gotten the output that I wanted. So just make sure that whenever you are using a command that has multiple selection options, that you are paying attention to which ones are currently active. Moving down, we have our direction options. So what these options allow us to do is it allows us to specify how our extrusion behaves in reference to its end point. Okay, so one side basically says that from our starting plane, we're only extruding to one side. So we're going in one direction. So in this case, we are going to extrude upward. So let's go ahead and set a distance in here. And as you can see, it only goes to one side. Now, we'll set this to two sides. And as you can see, we get a couple additional options here for dimensions. So we can use these like in all of the other cases, or we can specify an exact value. So let's go ahead and set a distance of 0.25 in this field. And as you can see, it's extruding downward by 0.25 inches, but it's still retaining that 0.4 inches in the opposite direction. And of course, we can also set independent taper angles. So let's say we want this one to be 0 and we want this one to be 5 degrees. And as you can see, we set a slight taper angle for this second side. Our final direction option is, of course, the symmetric option. And so this is similar to the two-sided one, but it extrudes symmetrically about that initial plane, okay, where your profile resides. So, of course, we can also set the distance off of a half length. So this is basically saying that I want it to extrude to a distance of 0.4 inches on either side, and then you would have to manually total those two values up to find the overall length. You can also specify the length off of the whole length. So if I want the whole length to be 1 inch, it's going to extrude up from the initial plane by 0.5 inches, and it's going to extrude down by the other 0.5 inches. Moving down, we have our extent type. So the extent type allows us to control how our extrusion terminates, so where it ends up and how it does so. So for all of the examples leading up to this point, we've been using distance. Okay, so this is where we set a distance value for the extrusion. So let's go ahead and take another look at that. I'll select this rectangular profile and we'll set a distance here of 1/2 inch. Okay, so this is just going to extrude that up by 1/2 inch. Next, we have our to object option. So like our start option where we had our object option, this allows us to control the termination of our extrusion at a particular reference plane or face. So let's go ahead and set this face as the maximum height for this raised feature. So all we have to do is make sure object select is already pre-selected. And we go ahead and click on that face. And as you can see, it brings that extrusion up until it reaches that height. And this is great for controlling multiple dimensions that are relevant to one another without having to go ahead and change multiple distances manually. So now let's take a look at the extend options within the to object selection. So we'll go ahead and select our profile of interest. In this case, we want to extend this raised feature up until this wall. Now, after I've already selected my profile and then selected the object that I want to extend this to, we get these two additional options that pop up. By default, we have to selected face. So this is exactly what you saw before, where we brought up the top of this extrusion to the max height that we specified based off of our reference face. However, we also have this option, which is to adjacent faces. So I want you to pay attention to something here. So as this gets extended up, we see that our part is flush with this, but we have this little protruding corner, okay? Let's say, for example, we wanted to extend this up until this face here. So up until this edge here. And to do so, we just click to adjacent faces. And what this is going to do is it's going to extend that extrusion up until your reference face or plane, but then it'll go just beyond that to any adjacent faces. Okay, so this is a very quick way to create a little bit more of a complex rib feature here on the edge of the enclosure. So of course, after we have that all set, we can also specify our offset values and our taper values, just like many other options that you're going to see for this particular command. The final extent type that we'll be discussing is the all option. Now, all extends the extrude through all visible bodies. So in this case, I have this face selected as my profile. I want to extend that to the end of the visible body or the end of this part. Okay, so in that case, that's going to be this face here. So let's go ahead and select all. And as you can see, it extends it all the way up until this face. I want to point out that it's assuming that I want to remove material. So it's set the operation to cut. We can actually change that easily by just changing it to join, and it will add material rather than remove it. Additionally, we can flip the direction by clicking this button here within the flip section, and that will just extend that extrude to the end of the part just in the opposite direction. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the various operations that we have available to us when executing an extrude. So what we'll do is we'll select this front face as our profile and extend that profile out this way. And as you can see here, we have our operations section that pops up, and it defaults to cut because it thinks that I want to remove material. Okay, so again, cut removes material from the solid body that your profile passes through. Join adds material, and it joins that new material with the existing material that belongs to that body. Next, we have intersect, and intersect just keeps any material that sort of gets in the way of that cross-sectional profile that you've extended through. Okay, so the only thing that coincides with that profile is that sidewall, okay? And so that's what intersect does for you. And then, of course, we have new body. So new body will extrude that profile, but classify it as a new solid body. So let's go ahead and try that. We'll click OK. And in our bodies folder within the browser, so you can expand that by clicking this little arrow here, now you can see we have two separate bodies, so I can hide each one independently. Our final operation type is the new component option. Okay, so new component creates new solid geometry, so it creates a solid body. However, it houses it under a separate component itself. So when we click OK, and go over to the browser, you'll notice that we get this new component that pops up. And if we expand that, you'll see that we have our own separate bodies folder separate from the cover at the top level. You can activate the various components independently by hovering over the name and clicking this little button that pops up next to it. And so now we see our newly extruded body separate or in the foreground of the rest of the existing part. So now let's go ahead and go back into the cover. Let's try to remove some material from the cover, but try to preserve this material here. So what we'll do is we'll go to Extrude, we'll select this face, and we'll pull it all the way through. So by default, it looks like it wants to remove the material, and it will. However, if we expand this little submenu here that says Objects to Cut by clicking on that arrow, we have two checkboxes. So the first checkbox is the original body that's housed under the cover top level, okay? However, we have this new component that we created down here. If we uncheck that, it's not going to remove the newly created geometry that we just made. So let's go ahead and click OK. And as you can see, it removed that other raised feature, but it preserved the feature from that secondary component. I'd like to go ahead and point out that when we enter the extrude menu, the operation options are already available to us from the start. So this is a great way for us to control what actually happens before it starts making assumptions of what we want to do. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the thin extrude option. So we'll go into Extrude, click Thin Extrude, and before we select any profiles, I want to point out that we can select either open or closed profiles for this. So what you'll see here in the model is that I created a sketch in which I projected the edges along these curved areas of the cover. So it's the interior edges that I've projected, and we will be using these profiles to create a wall that acts as a lap joint. Okay, so we'll specify a wall thickness off of these curves that we've projected. So now, one thing I want to talk about is this chaining option. Okay, so by default, it's usually enabled. And when it's enabled and we hover over a profile that has multiple segments that are tangent to one another. So in this case, we have a straight line here, and it's got an arc, and then it goes to another straight line, and then another curve here, and then another straight line, and so on and so forth until it terminates here. Okay, so if we hover over this part, you'll notice that it selects the entire profile together. Okay, so it's chaining all of those individual segments together because they're connected and they're tangent to one another. Now, if we deselect that and then hover over that same segment, you'll notice now only that straight line is selected. Okay, so with chaining deselected, you'll have greater control over what you're selecting. So depending on your use case, this is a pretty handy tool. Now, let's go ahead and re-enable that. We'll hover over that profile, left click, and then we'll click on this one as well. And now we can go ahead and just raise this wall up a little bit. Okay, so now let's take a look at what we have here. So as you can see, we have this thin profile that originates at that sketched line or that projected line. Now, one thing I want to go ahead and point out is that in the current state, this extrusion is just hanging off of the projected edge. So we actually want to go ahead and flip that to the other side of this edge. To do so, we can go down to the wall location option. Okay, so we're going to skip over all these other options because we've covered this already in the regular extrude command. Okay, so going down here to wall location, we can set this to side 2. Okay, so by default, it was set to side 1 and it was hanging off. So we can go ahead and set it to side 2 and it just flips it to the other side of that profile. Now we can also set this to center. And what this does is it centers up that wall thickness on the projected line itself. Okay, now let's set this back to side 2. And let's change this wall thickness to something a little bit thicker than 39 thousandths of an inch. We'll go 60 thousandths of an inch. And as you can see, it thickened up that wall a little bit. And now on our base, we can tweak the wall thicknesses between the base and on this cover to create a proper lap joint so that we don't have any void space in between the cover and the base itself. Now, we can also select close profiles with the thin extrude, so let's do so. So we're back in thin extrude. I'll select this top face here, and what it's going to do is it's going to create a wall thickness that's generated off of these edges here along this top face. So now we can go ahead and draw this extrusion up. And as you can see, we have that wall thickness that runs around that profile that we selected. Now let's go ahead and change the wall location to side 2. And that's going to offset it to the exterior. So it's going outward from the profile that we selected. And again, side 1 moves to the interior of the profile. And center just centers up that wall thickness on our selected profile. Now we can change this back to side 1, and we can actually perform a cut operation on this as well. So we just pull this down into the material. And as you can see here, we have removed material around that profile that we selected. That's all for this tutorial on the extrude command in Fusion 360. I really hope that you found this tutorial to be helpful and that you put what you've learned into practice so you can continue developing your skills as you go along. I'll see you again soon.